Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. If you're settling in, pulling the covers up, maybe dimming the lights, I'm really glad you found this. Honestly, I'm glad you're here. This is your space to just let go. Let go of the day, let go of whatever was chasing you around your brain for the last 16 hours, and just be here with me. We're going to spend some time together tonight, and I promise you, there's nothing urgent, nothing stressful, nothing that requires you to do anything at all except breathe and listen. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere a little different. Not a battlefield, not a royal court, not a war, just a kitchen, a medieval kitchen. Cold stone walls, a fire crackling low, and a woman standing over a barrel of salt, pressing a slab of pork deep into the white crystals with both hands, her knuckles going pale with the effort. She's not cooking dinner, she's buying time. And here is what I find quietly extraordinary about that image. She had no idea why it worked. She just knew it did. No science, no microbiology, no understanding of bacteria, of cells, of the invisible world crawling across every surface of every piece of meat the moment it leaves the animal. She just knew, because her mother knew, and her mother's mother knew, that salt and smoke and cold earth and certain mysterious liquids could hold death back for a little while longer. And honestly, that still gives me chills. So tonight, we're going to spend some time with one of the most underrated stories in all of human history. Not the kings who conquered land, not the generals who changed borders. The quiet, unglamorous, absolutely essential story of how ordinary people kept food from killing them for 1,000 years before anyone ever thought to plug a metal box into a wall and call it progress. And I promise you, by the time we're done, you will look at your refrigerator differently. Maybe even feel a little guilty about it. Just a little. Let me set the scene for you, because I think context is everything. The Middle Ages, roughly from the 5th century all the way to the 15th, stretched across about 1,000 years of European history. 1,000 years. Think about that for a second. 1,000 years of winters with no canned soup, no frozen meals, no Uber Eats pulling up to the castle gate at 10 o'clock in the evening. 1,000 years of people waking up every single morning with the same quiet, urgent question pressing on their chest like a stone. Is there enough food? Will it last? What happens if it doesn't? Because this wasn't hypothetical anxiety. Famine in medieval Europe wasn't rare. It was a recurring, grinding, terrifying fact of life. Historians estimate that in France alone, major regional famines struck roughly every 15 to 20 years throughout the medieval period. In the 14th century, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, just a few years before the Black Death arrived to make everything catastrophically worse, killed somewhere between 10 and 25% of the population across parts of Northern Europe. Let that number breathe for a moment. 10 to 25%. Not from plague, not from war, from hunger, from food that ran out or rotted or simply wasn't there. So when I say that food preservation was the most important technology in the medieval world, I mean that without any exaggeration at all. Salt was more valuable than iron. A well-stocked cellar could be the difference between a family surviving winter or not. And the men and women who truly mastered the art of keeping food alive through the cold months, they weren't alchemists or wizards. They were just paying very, very close attention. Now, here's the thing I want you to sit with tonight, and this is what really hooked me when I first started going down this rabbit hole. We tend to romanticize the medieval period in one of two ways. Either we see it as this grim, gray, plague-ridden horror, people living in mud, dying young, not knowing anything about anything, or we swing the other direction and make it all flowing gowns and feasts and noble knights doing noble things. And the truth is so much more interesting than either of those pictures. Because what the historical record actually shows us, in household account books, in estate records, in monastery inventories, in the practical manuals that wealthy households kept, is that medieval people had systems. Sophisticated, layered, carefully thought out systems for keeping food alive. They observed the natural world with an intensity that most of us have completely lost touch with. They knew which direction the wind came from in autumn. They knew which stone cellars stayed coolest in summer. They knew, through generations of hard-won knowledge, exactly how much salt per pound of pork would get you through to February without making the meat so aggressively salty it was basically inedible. Which, by the way, was apparently a real problem.
Medieval cookbooks, and yes, they existed, which is another thing that surprises people. Medieval cookbooks from the 13th and 14th centuries repeatedly warn cooks about oversalting preserved meats. Some recipes specifically instruct the cook to soak heavily salted meat in fresh water before cooking, just to pull some of the salt back out. That detail makes me smile every time I think about it, because it means that somewhere around the year 1250, some very tired cook was standing over a pot of brutally salty pork going, "Right, we're going to have to sort this out." Again, universal human experience across 800 years. But before we get deep into the individual methods, the salt, the smoke, the strange magic of fermentation, the underground kingdoms of cold stone, I want to make sure we understand something fundamental, something that shapes everything about how medieval people thought about food and time and survival. They had no concept of refrigeration. I know that sounds obvious, but I want you to really feel it for a moment. Not just they didn't have fridges, because we all know that intellectually. I mean, they had no mental model, no framework, no working understanding of the idea that slowing things down with cold could preserve food indefinitely. The Roman Empire used snow and ice for luxury cooling, packed into underground rooms called thermopolia for the very wealthy. But that knowledge largely dissolved with the empire, and it didn't really resurface at scale until much later in the medieval period, and even then only for the elite. For most medieval people, most of the time, the question was never, how do I keep this cold? The question was, how do I transform this food into something that death cannot touch? And that shift in framing from refrigeration to transformation is what produced all of the most fascinating preservation methods of the era. Because they weren't trying to pause food in time, they were trying to change it, to convert it into something fundamentally different, something that bacteria couldn't use, couldn't feed on, couldn't destroy. And in doing so, almost by accident, they invented flavors and textures and entire culinary traditions that we still celebrate today. Prosciutto, aged cheddar, sourdough bread, sauerkraut, salted cod, smoked salmon. Every single one of those things exists because someone, somewhere in medieval Europe or even earlier, was desperately trying to solve a survival problem. And the solution turned out to be delicious. I find that genuinely beautiful. The idea that beauty can come from desperation, that some of the most beloved flavors in human civilization were born not from creativity or abundance, but from fear. From the fear of an empty larder in January, from the fear of a long winter with hungry children, from the absolutely fundamental, deeply human drive to look at what you have and make it last. Now, over the course of our time together tonight, and for the next several hours, because there is genuinely so much to explore here, we're going to walk through every corner of this story. We're going to talk about salt, not just as a seasoning, but as a social hierarchy, a currency, and a weapon against time. We're going to talk about smoke and fire and why medieval people were, without knowing it, creating natural antibiotics in their chimneys every autumn. We're going to go underground into the cold cellars and storage pits where food was hidden from the sun and the warmth and the relentless creep of decay. We're going to talk about fermentation, that strange, beautiful process where controlled rot becomes preservation. We're going to talk about honey and fat and wax and the almost alchemical ways that medieval cooks used them to seal food away from time itself. We're going to talk about monks who quite accidentally became the world's first food scientists while simply trying to feed their communities through long winters. And we're going to talk about the spice trade and why the desire to preserve food didn't just shape what people ate, it shaped the entire map of the world. And yes, we're going to talk about the things that went wrong, because they went very wrong sometimes. And the stories of medieval food poisoning, of whole villages losing their minds from contaminated grain, those stories are not just dark curiosities, they're reminders of how much these people were genuinely wagering every time they opened a barrel or broke the seal on a crock. Every meal was, in some quiet way, an act of faith. But for right now, tonight, I just want you to breathe.
Let go of the day and start to imagine a world where keeping food alive was the most important thing you did. Not a burden, exactly, more like a conversation. A long, careful, daily conversation between human beings and the natural forces that were always trying to undo what they had built. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that I come back to again and again whenever I think about this period, is that they won that conversation. Not perfectly, not always, but often enough and cleverly enough to feed civilizations, build empires, fund wars, stock monasteries, fill market halls, and eventually pass that knowledge down through so many generations that fragments of it are still sitting in your kitchen right now. That jar of pickles in your fridge, that smoked salmon on your bagel, that sourdough starter on someone's counter still bubbling away descended from wild yeast that medieval bakers first coaxed out of the air centuries ago. We think we invented all of this. We didn't. We just forgot who taught us. So now that you understand why this obsession ran so deep, why a barrel of salt was more precious than most people's annual wages, and why a properly stocked root cellar was the difference between comfort and catastrophe, I want to start pulling back the curtain on how they actually did it. And we begin, as all the great medieval stories do, with something simple, something ancient, something so ordinary we sprinkle it over our eggs without a second thought, something that for 1,000 years held the line between life and ruin. Salt. Just say that word slowly for a second. Salt. It is so ordinary to us now that we barely register it. It sits in a little shaker on the kitchen table. We knock it over accidentally and then, depending on how superstitious we are, maybe toss a pinch over our left shoulder for good luck. We do not think about it. We do not worry about it. And that right there, that complete and total indifference to salt, is one of the clearest signs of just how far removed we are from the world we're about to step into. Because in medieval Europe, salt was not a condiment. Salt was power. Let me give you a number that I think will reframe everything. In 13th century England, a laboring peasant might earn somewhere around 1 penny a day for a full day's work in the fields. A bushel of good quality salt, roughly the amount a household might need to preserve their autumn slaughter of a single pig, could cost several days' wages. Several days for something we now buy in a cardboard cylinder for less than $1. And that pig wasn't just dinner. That pig was the family's entire protein supply for the winter. Every scrap of it needed to be salted correctly, stored correctly, and rationed carefully across months of cold. Get the salt wrong, too little, and the meat rotted anyway. Too much, and it became nearly inedible, so brutally saline that even cooking couldn't fully rescue it. And this is something I think about a lot when people romanticize the simplicity of medieval life. There's nothing simple about it. Every decision about food was a calculation, a gamble, a negotiation between what you had and what you needed and what nature was going to do to it in the meantime. So where did all this salt come from? This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because the geography of salt in medieval Europe was not random. It had shape, it had logic, and it had consequences that reached far beyond any kitchen. The most prized salt came from salt pans along the Atlantic coast, places like the Bay of Biscay, in what is now France and Spain, where shallow coastal lagoons allowed seawater to evaporate slowly in the sun, leaving behind thick crystalline deposits. This bay salt, as it was commonly called, was harvested in enormous quantities and shipped northward, up through the English Channel, into the North Sea, reaching markets in England, Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and as far east as Poland and Russia. And here is a detail I find quietly extraordinary. The salt trade was so fundamental to medieval commerce that it essentially created the infrastructure of northern European trade. The routes that ships traveled to carry salt north in autumn were the same routes that came back loaded with timber, furs, grain, and fish. The Hanseatic League, that powerful alliance of northern German trading cities that dominated Baltic commerce for nearly 3 centuries, built much of its wealth on the simple fact that it controlled the distribution of salt to the fishing communities of Scandinavia and the Baltic coast. Without salt to preserve the herring catch, there was no herring trade. Without the herring trade, there was no Hanseatic League. Without the Hanseatic League, the entire economic geography of medieval Northern Europe looks completely different. All of that tracing back to a mineral you knocked off your breakfast table this morning. But salt didn't just come from the sea, and this is a part of the story that sometimes gets overlooked because the coastal salt trade is more dramatic and well documented. Inland salt sources, salt springs, and underground salt deposits were critically important for communities that were too far from the coast to rely on bay salt. And these inland sources created their own economic ecosystems, their own power structures, their own quietly fascinating histories. In what is now central Germany, for instance, the town of Lüneburg sat atop one of the richest underground salt deposits in northern Europe. By the 12th century, Lüneburg's salt works were producing enormous quantities of brine salt, pumped from deep underground springs, boiled in large open pans over wood fires to evaporate the water and crystallize the salt. The process was energy intensive. The wood consumption alone was staggering, and historians have noted that the forests surrounding Lüneburg were progressively stripped to feed the salt works. An early medieval example of industrial deforestation, driven not by greed in any simple sense, but by the desperate need for a substance that kept people alive through winter. Lüneburg's salt traveled through the Hanseatic trade networks. It reached the herring markets of Scandinavia. It fed the great salting operations of the Baltic coast, and the wealth it generated made Lüneburg one of the most prosperous towns in northern Germany for centuries. The beautiful medieval architecture that tourists admire there today, the ornate brick churches, the guild halls, the merchant houses, was built on salt, literally. The foundations of some buildings have actually subsided over the centuries because the underground salt deposits they sit above have been so thoroughly mined that the earth beneath them has collapsed slightly. The town is slowly sinking into the voids left by the salt that paid for it. There is something almost poetically perfect about that. A town built by salt, sinking into the absence of salt. In England, the salt-producing towns of Cheshire, Nantwich, Middlewich, Northwich had been extracting salt from brine springs since Roman times. The names themselves tell the story. Wich is an Old English word that specifically refers to a salt-producing settlement. When you see wich at the end of an English town name, you're looking at a place that once made its living from salt. Norwich, Ipswich, Greenwich, these have different etymologies, but the Cheshire witches are salt towns through and through. Their brine springs were actively worked throughout the medieval period, and the salt they produced served local and regional markets across the English Midlands. Now, here's where I want to slow down, because I think this is the part that most people miss when they talk about salt and medieval preservation. We tend to think of salting as one thing. You rub salt on food and it doesn't go bad. But medieval salt preservation was actually a remarkably sophisticated spectrum of techniques, and the differences between them mattered enormously for both the quality of the preserved food and the length of time it could be stored. On one end, you had dry salting, the most direct approach. You pack the meat or fish in dry salt crystals, either rubbing them in firmly by hand or burying the food completely in a barrel of salt. The salt draws moisture out of the flesh through a process we now call osmosis, though obviously medieval practitioners had no such word for it. They just knew it worked. The liquid that leached out, a brine of water and salt and meat proteins, would pool at the bottom of the barrel. Sometimes it was drained, sometimes it was left, because that brine itself became a secondary preservation environment. Which brings us to the other end of the spectrum, wet brining, or brine curing. Here, the food was submerged in a prepared saltwater solution, sometimes with herbs, sometimes with a little vinegar, sometimes with other spices added for flavor and additional preservation. The ratio of salt to water was critical. Too weak a brine, and bacteria could still survive in it. Too strong, and the food became almost impossibly salty. Medieval cooks developed these ratios through pure empirical observation, through watching, tasting, comparing over many generations. There was no chemistry degree involved, just patience and attention, and the particular kind of intelligence that comes from having very high stakes. And then there was the question of which salt. Because here's something that genuinely surprises most people.
Not all salt was created equal in the medieval world, and the differences mattered enormously, not just for preservation, but for social status. Fine white salt, the kind that had been carefully evaporated and refined, free of the gray and brown minerals that contaminated cheaper varieties, was expensive, extraordinarily so. Coarse sea salt, what the records call bay salt, was cheaper, heavier, less refined, and worked perfectly well for industrial preservation, packing barrels of fish or curing large cuts of meat. But at the tables of the wealthy, the nobility, the clergy of high rank, you served fine salt, and not just in any container. The salt cellar, the vessel that held this precious white mineral, was one of the most elaborately crafted objects on a medieval dining table. Wealthy households commissioned salt cellars of silver, of gilt bronze, of carved ivory. They were often the centerpiece of the table. And this is where we get one of my favorite little windows into medieval social psychology. Guests who were seated above the salt cellar, that is, between the salt and the host at the head of the table, were people of high standing, important people, people the host wished to honor. Guests seated below the salt, further down the table, on the far side from the host, were of lower rank. They might still be welcome, they might still eat well, but the message was clear, and everyone in that room understood it without a word being spoken. You were above the salt, or you were not. The next time someone tells you table manners are superficial, I want you to remember that a mineral used to stop meat from rotting also became the physical measurement of social worth at the grandest tables in Europe. I have to pause here and be honest with you about something, because I think it adds a layer to this story that often gets skipped over. Salt preservation was not comfortable. The meat that came out of those barrels in February, the salted pork that a family had been rationing since November, was often, by modern standards, extremely unpleasant. It was dense, sometimes gray or slightly brown rather than pink, chewy in ways that fresh meat is not, and the flavor could be almost overwhelming, sharp, mineral-heavy, deeply savory in a way that could cross the line into aggressive if you weren't careful. Medieval cookbooks, the ones that have survived from the 13th and 14th centuries onward, are filled with instructions for managing this problem. Soaking the meat overnight in fresh water, changing the water multiple times, cooking it slowly with aromatics to soften the salt and coax back some of the original flavor. One detail in particular stays with me from historical food research: instructions for soaking salt cod. Dried and salted fish, which we'll get to in more detail in a later section, could involve soaking for up to 48 hours with multiple water changes before the fish was even close to edible. 48 hours of soaking before you could even begin cooking dinner.
And people did this every week without complaint, because the alternative, no protein at all in the depths of winter, was so much worse. There's also a dimension to salt preservation that I think often goes completely unexamined, and it's this. Salt was unequally distributed, and that inequality shaped who survived and who didn't in ways that were quiet and invisible and devastating. Peasant households used coarser, cheaper salt in larger quantities, heavy brining, aggressive preservation. The food that came out of those barrels was often harsher, saltier, less refined. Wealthy households could afford finer salts, better ratios, more careful techniques. They had servants to manage the process properly. They had large stone cellars with consistent cool temperatures that helped the brining work more evenly. And then there were communities, particularly in inland areas far from the coast, far from the major salt trade routes, where good preserving salt was genuinely difficult to obtain at any price. These communities developed their own workarounds, smoking more heavily, using fermentation as their primary preservation strategy, drying food in ways that required less salt. We'll talk about those methods in the sections ahead, but I want you to hold this thought for now. The geography of salt access in medieval Europe was, in a very real sense, the geography of nutritional survival. Where the salt routes ran, people ate better in winter. Where they didn't, winters were harder, food was scarcer, and the margin between enough and not enough was razor thin. Now, I promised you a story about salt that goes beyond the barrels and the brines, and here it is. In medieval England, salt production was so strategically important that the crown actively managed it. The Domesday Book, that extraordinary survey of English landholding commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086, records hundreds of salt-producing locations called salinae, distributed across coastal and inland brine areas. These weren't just noted for curiosity, they were cataloged because they were assets, taxable, controllable, militarily significant assets. To control the salt supply was to hold something close to control over the food security of the entire kingdom. And this logic wasn't unique to England. In France, the gabelle, a royal tax on salt, became one of the most hated levies in French history. It persisted for centuries. It was deeply unequal. Different regions paid wildly different rates, and certain privileged groups were exempt while ordinary people were not. And historians will tell you, quietly, carefully, that resentment over the gabelle was one of the many threads woven into the fabric of the French Revolution. Salt taxes, contributing to the revolution that changed the modern world. If that's not the most improbable sentence you've heard all evening, I don't know what is. But here's the thing about salt that I keep coming back to, the thing that makes me genuinely emotional about this particular part of the story. Medieval people used salt not just to preserve food, they used it to preserve time. What they were doing when they packed that pork into a barrel in November, when they rubbed salt crystals into a ham with cold, tired hands, when they lowered a crock of brined vegetables into the cellar floor, was making a bet on the future. They were saying, we will still be here in February. We will still need to eat in March. We are going to survive this winter. That barrel of salt, in a very real sense, was an act of hope. Not optimism. Medieval people were far too practical for easy optimism. But hope. The particular kind of hope that requires work and patience and skill and the willingness to plan for a future you cannot see clearly. And there's something about that, something I find deeply moving even now, that connects us to those people across 1,000 years of distance. We still salt things. We still cure meat, brine vegetables, season food with that same ancient white mineral. We do it mindlessly now, without a thought for what it once cost or what it once meant. But somewhere in the muscle memory of human civilization, the knowledge is still there. And now, because I don't want to let you get too comfortable just yet, I want to tell you about the other method that ran alongside salt through every autumn in medieval Europe. The one that didn't just preserve food, the one that changed it, that filled the air of every farmyard and every manor hall with a thick, sweet, ancient smell that medieval people associated with safety, with warmth, with the particular comfort of knowing that winter, at least, would not come for them entirely unprepared. Close your eyes for just a second, or keep them closed if they're already drifting that way. Imagine it's October, somewhere in the English countryside, around the year 1200. The air has that particular sharpness to it, the kind that gets into your lungs and reminds you, very quietly, that the warm months are done. The harvest is in, the last of the root vegetables have been pulled from the earth, and now, in farmyards and manor courtyards and monastery outbuildings all across northern Europe, something is happening that has been happening every single autumn for longer than anyone can remember. Fires are being lit. Not cooking fires, not warming fires, long, slow, smoldering fires, fed with carefully chosen wood, kept deliberately low, allowed to breathe just enough to produce thick, rolling clouds of smoke rather than clean, open flame. And above those fires, hanging from wooden beams and iron hooks and rough rope, are the pieces of meat and fish that a family, a community, a lord's household is counting on to survive the next 4 months. The smoke rises. It coils around the flesh. It seeps into every fiber, every surface, every tiny crevice. And somehow, in a way that nobody in that farmyard could explain in scientific terms, but that everyone understood instinctively, the meat begins to change. It darkens. It firms. It develops a depth of flavor that raw, salted meat simply does not have. And crucially, it lasts. Now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever actually thought about why smoke preserves food? I mean, really thought about it, not just accepted it as a fact the way we accept that the sun rises in the east or that gravity pulls things downward.
Because the answer, when you dig into it, is one of those beautiful moments where medieval practical knowledge turns out to be doing something extraordinarily sophisticated without having any idea that it was. Here is what is actually happening when smoke penetrates meat. Wood smoke is not just smoke. It is a complex chemical cocktail, a mixture of hundreds of different compounds released as the wood slowly combusts. And among those compounds are several that we now know have powerful antimicrobial properties. Phenols, formaldehyde, yes, that formaldehyde, though in concentrations far too low to be harmful to humans at normal exposure. Acetic acid, creosote compounds. These substances, when they settle onto the surface of meat or fish, do several things simultaneously. They create a physical barrier, a thin, slightly hardened outer layer that slows the penetration of moisture and airborne bacteria. They inhibit the growth of the specific microorganisms most responsible for meat spoilage, and they lower the water activity of the surface tissue, which is essentially the same mechanism that salt uses, but achieved through a completely different pathway.
Medieval people did not know any of this. They had no concept of phenols, they had never heard of microorganisms. Germ theory wouldn't arrive for another 600 years. But they knew, with absolute certainty passed down through generations of careful observation, that meat hung over smoke lasted longer than meat that wasn't. And so they built smokehouses, they developed techniques, they argued, I have no doubt, about which wood produced the best smoke for which purpose. Because it turns out, and this is something that modern food scientists have confirmed, it absolutely does matter. Different woods produce smoke with meaningfully different chemical profiles. Hardwoods, oak, beech, apple, cherry, burn slowly and produce dense, complex smoke that penetrates deeply and adds rich, layered flavor. Softwoods like pine and spruce were generally avoided for smoking food, not just because of flavor, but because they produce higher concentrations of certain resinous compounds that, at heavy exposure, can be genuinely unpleasant. Some sources suggest that pine-smoked food had a harsh, almost turpentine-like quality that most people found disagreeable, which, to be fair, does sound disagreeable. Medieval smokehouse operators, and by operators I mean farm wives, servants, monks, manor cooks, developed strong regional preferences for specific woods that were entirely based on practical experience. In parts of England and northern France, oak was the wood of choice. In Scandinavia, birch and alder were common. In parts of Germany, beechwood smoking became so associated with local food traditions that specific regional variants of smoked sausage and ham still carry those same wood signatures today. These are not coincidences. These are the fingerprints of 1,000 years of empirical refinement, of people paying attention, of people caring enough about the outcome to remember what their grandmother used and her grandmother before her. Let me tell you about the actual physical structure of a medieval smokehouse because I think it helps make all of this more real. The typical English or Northern French smokehouse of the 12th or 13th century was a relatively simple structure. A small, enclosed building, sometimes a dedicated outbuilding, sometimes just a section of the main house or barn partitioned off for the purpose. The key features were a fire pit or hearth at the base, usually recessed into the floor or slightly below grade, and a series of horizontal beams or metal hooks at varying heights above the fire, from which the meat or fish was suspended. The fire was kept deliberately low. This is critical, and it's a point that medieval smoking manuals, and yes, references to proper fire management for smoking do exist in estate records, emphasize repeatedly. You did not want flame, you wanted heat and smoke. Too much flame meant the meat cooked rather than smoked, which defeated the purpose entirely. Cooked meat without the preservative compounds of smoke spoiled just as quickly as any other cooked meat. The goal was to bathe the food in smoke continuously, at a temperature warm enough to promote moisture evaporation from the surface, but cool enough to avoid actually cooking the interior. This is what modern food science calls cold smoking, as opposed to hot smoking, which cooks the food simultaneously. Cold smoking typically occurs at temperatures below about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to encourage the smoke to penetrate, but not warm enough to denature the proteins in the meat. Hot smoking, by contrast, takes place at higher temperatures and produces a product that is both smoked and cooked, more immediately edible, but with a shorter storage life because the cooked proteins are more susceptible to subsequent decay. Medieval practitioners used both approaches, though they wouldn't have categorized them in quite those terms. Cold-smoked products, like certain styles of preserved fish and long-cured hams, were intended for extended storage, weeks or months. Hot-smoked products, like certain sausages and smaller cuts of meat, were typically consumed more quickly, within days or a couple of weeks. The choice depended on what you were preserving, how long you needed it to last, and what other preservation methods, salt primarily, were being used in combination. And that combination, salt and smoke together, was the backbone of medieval meat preservation. Almost nothing was smoked without being salted first. The two methods worked synergistically in a way that medieval cooks understood perfectly well in practical terms, even if they couldn't have articulated the chemistry. Salt drew moisture from the interior of the meat, making the deeper tissues less hospitable to bacterial growth. Smoke sealed and protected the exterior, creating a chemical and physical barrier against recontamination. Together, they produced a preserved product that was dramatically more stable than either method could achieve alone. The timing of this process varied, but a typical sequence for preserving a side of pork, the most commonly preserved meat in medieval England, might go something like this. The meat was first heavily salted, dry rubbed or packed in salt crystals, and left in a cool space for anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks, depending on the size of the cut and the ambient temperature. During this curing period, the salt penetrated the meat and drew out significant moisture, which pooled in the bottom of the container and was periodically drained. After the salt cure was judged complete, and this judgment was made entirely by experience, by the feel and appearance of the meat, by the amount of liquid it had released, the meat was removed, sometimes briefly rinsed or wiped down to remove excess surface salt, and then hung in the smokehouse. The smoking phase might last another 1 to 3 weeks for a large piece of pork. During that time, the fire was maintained continuously, day and night, at that low, patient, smoldering level that produced steady smoke without flame. Someone had to tend that fire. In a large household, this was typically a servant's job. In a smaller household, it was everyone's job, shared in rotation through the family. In a monastery, it might be assigned to a specific lay brother whose dedication to that single task freed the ordained monks for prayer and study. I find something quietly touching about that image. A person whose entire contribution to the community's survival for weeks at a time was sitting by a fire in a dark, smoky shed, adding wood when the flames guttered, damping the fire back down when it burned too high. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing anyone writes epic poems about. But without that person, the meat spoiled. The winter got harder. The margin between enough and not enough shrank a little more. Medieval labor was full of these invisible, unglamorous, absolutely critical roles. The fire tender, the cellar checker, the barrel watcher, the people who kept the quiet machinery of survival running while everyone else slept. But here is where I want to go a little deeper, because the story of medieval smoking is not just about farmhouses and preserved pork. It is also about fish, and specifically it is about one fish that I would argue changed the economic destiny of an entire civilization. The herring. Small, oily, abundant in the North Sea and Baltic waters in quantities that are genuinely difficult to comprehend by modern standards. The herring was one of the most important food sources in all of medieval Northern Europe. And crucially, it was one of the most perishable. Fresh herring begins to deteriorate almost immediately after being pulled from the water. It is rich in the oils that make it nutritious, but those same oils oxidize rapidly, turning the flesh rancid within hours in warm weather. Without preservation, herring could only feed the communities immediately adjacent to the fishing grounds. With smoking, and with salting, which worked in combination, herring became something else entirely. It became a commodity. Smoked and salted herring, known in England as kippers when split and cold smoked, or red herrings when heavily smoked until deeply colored and intensely flavored, could survive weeks or months of travel. And this changed everything. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the preserved herring trade was one of the most significant commercial operations in Northern Europe. The annual herring fair at Great Yarmouth on the English coast drew merchants from across the continent. Barrels of smoked and salted herring traveled through trade networks stretching from England to Poland, from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean.
There is a detail in the historical record that I find almost poetic. Kippers, smoked herring from the North Sea coast, were documented in market records as far away as Constantinople. Constantinople, which is, to be clear, roughly 2,000 miles from the North Sea. A little smoked fish packed in a barrel, traveling 2,000 miles to feed someone at the edge of the Byzantine world. All because someone learned to hang fish over a fire at the right temperature with the right wood for the right amount of time. The economics of the herring trade were genuinely enormous. Historians estimate that the medieval herring fishery of the North Sea and the Baltic was one of the largest organized food production operations in pre-industrial Europe. During the peak herring migration seasons, typically late summer and autumn, fleets of hundreds of boats would set out from ports along the English, Dutch, Danish, and Scandinavian coasts. The catches were processed immediately on shore, or sometimes on the boats themselves, gutted, salted, packed in barrels, and then either sold directly at coastal markets or shipped inland through the river systems and overland trade routes of northern Europe. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because the herring trade didn't just feed people, it funded cities, it built fleets, it created the economic infrastructure that later made possible the great maritime explorations of the 15th and 16th centuries. The Dutch, in particular, built what amounted to a medieval herring empire. In the 14th century, a Dutch fisherman named Willem Bukelzoon, or so the tradition claims, though the attribution is debated, is credited with developing an improved technique for gutting and packing herring in salt aboard the fishing boats themselves, rather than waiting until the catch was brought ashore. This innovation, known as gibbing, allowed the fish to be preserved faster and more consistently, reducing spoilage losses and dramatically increasing the commercial value of each catch. The Dutch herring fleet, using this technique, became one of the most profitable commercial operations in late medieval Europe. The wealth it generated flowed into Dutch ports Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Delft, and contributed directly to the economic rise of the Netherlands as a major European trading power. There is a famous saying attributed to the Dutch, though its precise origin is uncertain. Amsterdam was built on herring bones. It's an exaggeration, but not much of one.
All of that economic power, all of that urban growth, all of that geopolitical consequence, tracing back to a small, oily fish and the ancient, patient, beautiful technology of salt and smoke. Now, I want to be honest about something here, because I think history deserves that honesty. Smoking was not a perfect technology. It worked remarkably well by the standards of what was available, but it had limits, and medieval people knew those limits intimately. The preservative effect of smoke was primarily a surface phenomenon. The outer layers of the meat received the most protection. Deeper into a thick cut, the penetration of smoke compounds was limited. This meant that for larger pieces of meat, whole legs of pork, large sides of beef, smoking alone was rarely sufficient. It almost always needed to be combined with salting, which worked from the inside out as the salt drew moisture from the deeper tissues. The combination of salt and smoke together was, in practice, dramatically more effective than either method alone. And medieval practitioners figured this out through trial and error long before anyone could have articulated why it worked. The sequence was typically salt first, to begin drawing moisture and create a partial barrier against spoilage, then smoke to harden and protect the surface and add that additional layer of antimicrobial chemistry. The specific timing varied. Different households, different regions, different traditions had their own approaches, some salting for days before smoking, some doing both simultaneously, some alternating between the two. What they all shared was the underlying logic, even if they'd have described it in completely different terms than I just did. There is also a dimension to smoking that I think deserves its own moment, because it tends to get overlooked in the purely practical conversation. Smoke was sacred. I don't mean that in a vague, metaphorical way. I mean that in many medieval communities, particularly in the folk traditions of rural northern Europe, the smoke that rose from a hearth or a smokehouse carried genuine spiritual significance. Fire was life. The hearth fire was the center of the household, sometimes literally never allowed to go out from one generation to the next in certain traditions. And smoke, the visible breath of fire, was seen as a purifying force, something that drove away illness, bad spirits, and the invisible corruptions that turned good food to rot. Medieval people didn't have the vocabulary of microbiology, but they had observed correctly that things hung in smoke didn't decay the way other things did. And in a world where the explanation for why anything happened was usually theological or supernatural, the conclusion was almost inevitable. Smoke cleanses. Smoke protects. Fire is a gift that keeps things whole. I find that beautiful in the way that a lot of medieval thinking is beautiful. Not because it was scientifically accurate, but because it arrived at a true observation through a completely different pathway. The fire did protect them. The smoke did cleanse the meat in its own chemical way. They were right. They were just right for reasons they couldn't have imagined. Let me give you one more specific detail before we float onward, because I think it grounds this whole section in something real and tangible. I mentioned stockfish briefly in passing, but it deserves a fuller treatment here alongside smoking, because the two traditions, smoking and wind drying, were deeply intertwined in the Northern European preserved fish industry. Stockfish, if you recall, is cod, split down the middle, fixed to a wooden rack or a pole, and then left outside in the cold, dry, windswept air of the Norwegian coast for several months. No salt, no smoke, just wind and cold. The result is a piece of fish so thoroughly desiccated that it becomes hard as wood, literally. There are historical accounts of it being struck with mallets to break it apart before it could be cooked. You had to soak it, sometimes for days, before it softened enough to eat. And yet stockfish was one of the most widely traded food commodities in all of medieval Europe because it lasted essentially indefinitely if kept dry. A barrel of stockfish on a ship could feed a crew for months. It could be stored in a warehouse for years. It could travel to markets that fresh or even smoked fish could never reach. The Norwegian coastline, particularly the Lofoten Islands, became one of the most economically important food production regions in all of medieval Europe, almost entirely on the basis of stockfish. The cold, dry Arctic wind did what no other technology could do. It removed moisture so completely, so relentlessly, that bacteria simply had nothing to work with. Nature itself was the preservation method. And medieval Norwegians, to their extraordinary credit, looked at their brutal climate and thought, we're going to use this, not survive despite it, use it.
Which brings me to something I think about a lot. We have this tendency, and I catch myself doing it too, to feel a little sorry for people in the past, to imagine their lives as smaller, harder, more limited than ours. And there were absolutely ways in which they were harder, I won't pretend otherwise. But when I look at the sophistication of medieval smoking and drying, at the way these communities read their climate, their landscape, their available resources, and built entire food systems around what their environment could offer, I don't feel sorry for them. I feel something closer to admiration, and maybe, if I'm being really honest, a little bit of humility. Because these people were solving, with no scientific instruments and no formal education, the same fundamental problem that food scientists spend careers studying today. How do you keep biological material from breaking down? They didn't know the question in those terms, but they found the answer over and over again in different climates with different materials through different traditions. They found it, and they passed it forward. Now, we've talked about salt drawing moisture out from the inside. We've talked about smoke building a chemical fortress on the outside. But both of those methods, for all their power, worked primarily on surfaces, on the external conditions of the food. There was another approach that medieval people used, one that worked on a completely different principle, one that didn't fight decay from the outside, one that didn't try to remove moisture or kill bacteria at the surface. Instead, it went underground, literally. And the cold, dark, quiet world beneath the earth, the cellars and pits and stone chambers that medieval communities built and relied on, turns out to be one of the most elegant food preservation systems ever conceived. Not because anyone designed it that way, but because the earth itself, at the right depth, maintains almost exactly the right temperature year-round. without any energy input, without any maintenance, just physics. And the story of how medieval people discovered that and built around it, and how profoundly it shaped everything from peasant survival to the architecture of great manor houses, that is what we're settling into right now. There is something about going underground that has always made humans feel a certain way. A little uneasy, maybe. A little primal. The darkness, the quiet, the way the temperature drops almost immediately as you descend the first few steps below the surface. And yet, for the better part of 1,000 years, that uneasiness was completely beside the point, because underground was where the food lived. Underground was where families kept the things they could not afford to lose, and the people who understood the earth beneath their feet, who paid attention to its rhythms, its temperatures, its moods across the seasons, those people ate in February when others didn't. Let me paint you a picture. It is midsummer, somewhere in rural England, around the year 1300. Above ground, the sun is relentless. The air shimmers over the fields. Flies cluster on anything that isn't moving fast enough to discourage them. And yet, if you were to descend into the root cellar dug beneath an ordinary farmhouse, down a narrow set of stone steps, through a heavy wooden door, you would feel it immediately. Cool air. Not cold exactly, not uncomfortably so, but a steady, reliable coolness that has nothing to do with the season above. Roughly 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. In summer, that is a refrigerator. In winter, it is just above freezing, cool enough to slow decay dramatically, but not so cold that root vegetables freeze and turn to mush. And this temperature stability, this remarkable consistency, was not something medieval people engineered deliberately in the sense of calculating soil thermal properties. They discovered it by digging, by noticing that the earth at a certain depth simply held. It kept a temperature that neither summer heat nor winter cold could fully penetrate. And once they noticed, they built around it. The physics behind this is genuinely elegant, and I want to take a moment with it, because I think it makes the whole thing more wonderful, not less. The Earth's surface temperature fluctuates dramatically with the seasons, baking in summer, freezing in winter, with swings of sometimes 60 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit between the extremes. But soil is an insulator, and as you go deeper, the soil buffers those surface fluctuations more and more effectively. At roughly 4 to 6 feet below the surface, depending on latitude and local soil composition, the temperature stabilizes at something close to the average annual temperature of that location. In most of temperate northern and western Europe, that average annual temperature sits in the range of approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which happens to be, quite by coincidence, almost exactly the temperature range that modern food scientists identify as optimal for storing root vegetables, cured meats, hard cheeses, preserved fruits, and fermented beverages. Medieval people did not know they were operating in an optimal temperature range. They just knew that food kept down there, and food didn't keep up here. That was enough. Now, what I find genuinely fascinating, and what I think tends to get glossed over in most tellings of this story, is how remarkably varied medieval underground storage actually was. We tend to imagine a single thing when we hear root cellar, a hole in the ground, maybe with some shelves, turnips, potatoes, basic. But the reality across medieval Europe was a spectrum of sophistication that ranged from that simple pit to some genuinely impressive architectural achievements. At the most basic level, you had what historians sometimes call clamp storage, essentially a pile of root vegetables, usually turnips, parsnips, or carrots, covered with a layer of straw for insulation and then a layer of soil over the top. No construction required, no tools beyond a spade, just the understanding that burying your harvest under enough earth would keep it alive through winter. This was accessible to almost anyone. Even the poorest peasant household could do this, and it worked. Not perfectly, there was always some loss to rot at the edges of the pile where the insulation was thinner, but enough of the harvest would survive to matter. I should note here that potatoes were not yet available in medieval Europe. They wouldn't arrive from the Americas until the 16th century.
Medieval root storage was built around turnips, parsnips, carrots, beets, and various other roots that we tend to overlook now, but that were absolutely central to the medieval diet. The humble turnip, in particular, deserves more respect than it typically receives. For centuries, it was one of the most important foods in Northern European agriculture. Reliable, hardy, storable, and nutritious enough to keep body and soul together through the leanest months. Moving up the complexity scale, you had dug cellars, actual excavated chambers lined with stone or timber to prevent the walls from collapsing inward, accessed by steps or a ladder, often built directly beneath or adjacent to the main living structure. These were more expensive to build and required real skill to construct properly, but they were also dramatically more effective. The stone lining helped regulate humidity, which is actually just as important as temperature for food storage. Too dry, and root vegetables shriveled and lost nutrition. Too damp, and mold spread rapidly through everything. The right stone. Local limestone was particularly valued for this purpose in parts of England and France, created an environment that balanced these competing needs in a way that bare earth walls could not. Limestone, it turns out, has a natural tendency to absorb excess moisture from the air when humidity is high and release it slowly when humidity drops. It acts, in effect, as a passive humidity regulator. Medieval builders did not understand the mineralogical reasons for this behavior. They just knew that limestone cellars stayed drier and that food kept better in them, which was, as usual, entirely sufficient. And then, at the highest end of the spectrum, there were the great cellars of medieval estates and monasteries. These were not simple storage holes. These were designed spaces, vaulted stone ceilings that distributed weight evenly and resisted collapse. Thick walls, sometimes 3 or 4 feet of solid masonry, that provided extraordinary thermal insulation. Multiple chambers for different storage purposes, because the medieval food manager understood that different foods had different needs. A well-designed large cellar might have separate areas for wine and ale, where slightly different humidity and temperature conditions were preferred. Separate sections for root vegetables, for cured meats, for cheese. Some even had channels built into the floor to manage drainage, because condensation was a constant challenge, and pooling water at the base of stored burl barrels was an invitation to exactly the kind of mold and rot you were trying to prevent. Think about that level of practical engineering. No formal architectural training, no textbooks, no engineering degree, just generations of accumulated knowledge about what worked and what didn't, encoded in the hands and memories of the people who built and maintained these spaces. I want to tell you about a specific place, because I think it makes all of this concrete in a way that statistics and generalities can't quite achieve. Chateau Gaillard, a castle built by Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart, on a dramatic cliff above the Seine River in Normandy, completed around the year 1198. Richard built it in an almost impossibly short time, roughly 2 years, which for a fortification of that scale was astonishing. And the historical record suggests he was obsessive about its design. Now, Chateau Gaillard is usually discussed in terms of its military architecture, its concentric walls, its strategic position, the famous siege it endured in 1203 and 1204. But what tends to get far less attention is the infrastructure built into its lower levels. Storage chambers. Extensive, carefully planned underground and semi-underground storage spaces designed to allow the castle garrison to withstand a prolonged siege. Because a castle, ultimately, is only as strong as its food supply. No walls are thick enough to protect you from starvation. And the great castle builders of the medieval period understood this with absolute clarity. The design of the storage levels, the positioning relative to the cliff face to maximize natural cool air circulation, the thickness of the walls, the arrangement of the chambers, reflects an understanding of food preservation that was baked into the very bones of the building. When you build a castle, you're not just building defenses, you're building a system for keeping people alive over time. And cold, dark, carefully constructed underground space was a non-negotiable part of that system. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a really old building, a cathedral crypt, an old farmhouse basement, a wine cave, and felt that particular quality of the air? That coolness that feels almost physical, like something you could hold in your hand? There is a reason that feeling is so distinctive. It is the accumulated thermal mass of centuries of stone doing exactly what medieval builders intended it to do. Those spaces weren't just old, they were designed to feel that way. The thickness of the stone, the depth below grade, the small, high windows, if any, that minimized warm air infiltration while still allowing minimal ventilation. These were not accidents of construction. They were the result of builders who understood, in a deeply practical and embodied way, what they were trying to achieve. And walking into one of those spaces today, especially if you know what you're looking for, is a kind of conversation across time. The stone is still doing its job, 800 years later. But storage, as sophisticated as it became, had its own significant challenges. And I think it's important to talk about those honestly, because the medieval relationship with underground storage was not one of smooth, reliable success. It was a constant negotiation.
Humidity was the great enemy. Get the moisture level wrong in a cellar too high, and you had mold creeping across everything. Not just surface mold, easily brushed away, but the deep, penetrating kind that worked its way into the core of a root vegetable or a cheese and destroyed it from the inside out. And the challenge was that the very thing that made cellars useful, their cool, enclosed environment, also tended to trap moisture. Condensation formed on cool stone walls, moisture wicked up from the earth floor. The vegetables themselves released moisture as they slowly respired in storage. Managing this required ventilation, some controlled flow of air through the space, which in turn required openings in the walls or ceiling, which in turn compromised some of the thermal insulation you were trying to maintain. It was a constant balancing act. Too much ventilation and you lost the cool, stable temperature. Too little and the humidity rose to levels where mold thrived. Rodents were another persistent problem. Rats and mice were not a minor inconvenience in a medieval cellar. They were a genuine threat to survival. A bad infestation in the weeks between harvest and deep winter could compromise a significant portion of a household's stored food. Medieval accounts, from estate management records, from monastery documents, from household manuals, return again and again to the challenge of keeping vermin out of storage spaces. Cats, obviously, were the primary biological control. The practical value of cats in medieval society had almost nothing to do with companionship and everything to do with grain stores and cellars. Stone-lined floors and walls helped. Raised shelving that kept food off the ground helped more. Carefully fitted wooden lids on barrels and crocks were essential. But none of these measures were perfect. Loss was always part of the calculation. And this constant grinding reality of partial loss is something I think we genuinely cannot fully appreciate from our position of refrigerated, vacuum-sealed, thoroughly preserved abundance. Every medieval household that went into winter with a full cellar knew that not everything in it would survive until spring. The question was never, will we lose some food? The question was always, how much will we lose, and will we still have enough? There is one more aspect of underground storage that I don't want to skip over because I think it reveals something important about the social structure of medieval communities. Access to underground storage was not equal. This might seem obvious. Of course, wealthy people had better facilities, but the specific ways in which inequality played out in food storage are illuminating. A large monastic community or a wealthy manor estate might have cellar space measured in hundreds of square feet, stone-lined, multi-chambered, with dedicated personnel. A cellarer, a specific role in the monastic tradition, whose entire job was the management and rotation of stored provisions. The role of the cellarer in a medieval monastery was not a minor position. It required knowledge of which foods stored best where, how to manage the rotation of stocks, older provisions used before newer ones to minimize waste, how to assess the condition of stored food by sight and smell, and how to plan consumption over the months to ensure that nothing critical ran out before the next harvest. These were genuine management skills, administrative skills, the kind of careful, systematic thinking that, in a modern context, we'd associate with logistics and supply chain management. And monasteries, it turns out, were extraordinarily good at it. Their survival records, the documents that show what monastic communities ate across the seasons, how they managed their provisions, when they experienced shortage, suggest that well-managed monasteries maintained food security at a level that most secular communities simply couldn't match.
Which is one of the reasons, by the way, that monasteries became such important centers of local community support in difficult times. A monastery with a well-stocked cellar and a skilled cellarer was a resource. In famine years, it was sometimes the only resource. And then there were the peasant households, who had, in most cases, a simple dug pit, perhaps lined with straw, perhaps covered with a wooden hatch. No dedicated management, no rotation strategy, no specialist knowledge beyond what had been passed down through the family. Just a hole in the ground and hope. The gap between those two realities, between the vaulted monastic cellar with its skilled cellarer and the peasant's earthen pit, is not just a gap in comfort or sophistication. It is a gap in survival probability. And when I think about the medieval food system as a whole, that gap sits with me, because the ingenuity was real, the knowledge was real, the practical sophistication was real, but it was not equally distributed. And the people who most needed reliable food storage, the people living closest to the margin with the least room for error, were precisely the ones with the least access to the best techniques. That is not a medieval problem. That is a very, very old human problem, one that we are, in different forms, still working on.
So we have gone deep into the earth. We've explored the cool, dark world beneath the farmhouse floor in the monastery courtyard. We have talked about stone and straw and soil, and the quiet physics of the earth doing what the earth has always done. Unbothered, reliable, faithful to its own temperature across every season. But here is something worth sitting with as we move forward. Every preservation method we have talked about so far, the salt, the smoke, the cold, dark earth, every single one of them works by slowing things down, by creating conditions where decay proceeds so slowly that food outlasts the season. What we have not yet talked about is the preservation method that works in the opposite direction entirely, the one that doesn't slow decay down, the one that accelerates it, deliberately, controllably, and then somehow, remarkably, uses the products of that controlled decay to prevent any further decay from happening at all. It is the most counterintuitive idea in this entire story, and medieval people stumbled onto it almost certainly by accident, somewhere back in the deep past before the Middle Ages even began. It gave them beer. It gave them cheese. It gave them bread with a depth of flavor that no commercial yeast can fully replicate. And it saved millions of lives in ways that had nothing to do with the flavor of the food. We're talking about fermentation.
All right, so I need you to do something for me before we go any further. I need you to think about the last time you ate something sour. Not unpleasantly sour, not this milk has turned sour. The good kind. A spoonful of yogurt in the morning, a forkful of sauerkraut alongside a bratwurst, a slice of sourdough bread with that particular tang that supermarket bread simply does not have, a cold glass of beer at the end of a long day. Now hold that flavor in your mind for a second, because what you are tasting in every single one of those things is not just food. You are tasting survival. You are tasting the residue of one of the most important biological discoveries in all of human history. A discovery that nobody made deliberately, a discovery that happened, as the best ones often do, because someone left something out a little too long and then, instead of throwing it away, took a cautious sniff, a tentative taste, and thought, actually that's not bad. Fermentation is, at its core, a process of transformation. You take a food, grain, milk, cabbage, grapes, apples, practically anything with sufficient sugars or starches, and you introduce microorganisms, or simply allow the ones already naturally present to do their work. Those microorganisms, yeast, bacteria, various combinations thereof, consume the sugars and produce byproducts, alcohol in some cases, lactic acid in others, carbon dioxide, acetic acid. And here is the key thing, the thing that makes fermentation so extraordinary as a preservation tool. Those byproducts create an environment that is hostile to the specific bacteria responsible for decay and illness. In other words, the fermentation process, by transforming the food into something else, simultaneously poisons the environment against the microorganisms that would otherwise destroy it. It is, when you think about it, one of the most elegant defense mechanisms in nature. You fight invisible threats with other invisible things. You use controlled, beneficial microbial activity to prevent harmful microbial activity. A biological arms race playing out inside a clay pot in a medieval farmhouse. And the people managing that pot had absolutely no idea that was what they were doing. They just knew it worked. The question of where fermentation begins as a human practice is genuinely humbling, because the honest answer is we don't know. We know it is extraordinarily old. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans were producing fermented beverages, likely grain-based, possibly fruit-based, as far back as 9,000 years ago in China. There is a theory, contested but fascinating, that the desire for reliably fermented grain was actually one of the driving forces behind the shift from nomadic hunter-gatherer life to settled agriculture. Not bread, as we usually tell the story, beer.
The argument goes roughly like this. Wild grains are nutritious but unpredictable. Fermenting them into a stable beverage concentrates their nutrition, neutralizes some of their natural toxins, and creates something that keeps far longer than raw grain would. The drive to have a reliable supply of that beverage may have been enough to motivate people to stay in one place, plant deliberately, and develop the infrastructure of settled life. Now, I want to be careful here. This is a hypothesis, not a settled historical conclusion. Scholars debate it vigorously, but even as a hypothesis, I find it remarkable. The possibility that civilization, agriculture, settlement, the whole trajectory of human organization might have grown partly out of the desire to reliably produce fermented food and drink. That our entire modern world traces one of its deepest roots back to someone, somewhere, discovering that left-out grain becomes something powerful and strange and worth building your life around. In medieval Europe specifically, fermentation was everywhere, and I mean that in the most literal possible sense. It was in the bread, it was in the ale, it was in the wine, it was in the cheese. It was in the preserved vegetables. It was in the butter. It was in the preserved fish sauces that coastal communities used as flavor enhancers, in the same way their Roman predecessors had used garum, that pungent, extraordinarily intense fermented fish condiment that had been a cornerstone of Roman cooking and whose tradition, in various forms, persisted well into the medieval period along Mediterranean coastlines. Fermentation was not a technique that medieval people chose to use alongside other techniques. It was the baseline condition of most of what they ate. Let me start with the one that I think most people underestimate, and that is ale, not wine. Wine gets all the historical romance, all the monastery associations, all the sophisticated cultural narrative. Ale, small ale specifically, a low-alcohol fermented grain beverage that was produced in enormous quantities in medieval England and Northern Europe, and that was consumed daily by virtually everyone, including children. Let that sit for a second. Including children. And before you raise an eyebrow at that, the alcohol content of small ale was genuinely low. Estimates from historical brewing records suggest somewhere around 1 to 2% alcohol by volume, compared to the 5% or more in a modern beer. The reason it was given to children, and to everyone else, constantly, as a replacement for water, was not intoxication. It was safety. Medieval water sources were frequently contaminated. Rivers, wells, and communal water supplies near populated areas were regularly compromised by animal waste, human waste, and the general biological chaos of pre-modern settlement. Waterborne illness, dysentery, typhoid fever, and various other gastrointestinal diseases was a genuine, persistent killer. Ale was not, because the brewing process, even for small ale, involved heating the liquid, which killed most pathogens, and then the fermentation process produced enough alcohol and acidity to prevent recontamination. Drinking ale was, in a very real sense, drinking treated water, and medieval people, without any concept of germ theory or water contamination, had figured this out empirically. They didn't know why ale was safer than water from the river. They just knew that people who drank mostly ale got sick less often than people who drank mostly water. That observation, followed carefully across generations, saved an incalculable number of lives. And here is where I want to offer a personal observation, because I think it changes how we see medieval people.
We tend to characterize medieval peasants and common people as uneducated, as superstitious, as having a fundamentally irrational relationship with the world. But when I look at the evidence of what they actually did, what they ate, how they preserved their food, how they managed their water supply, I see something different. I see people who were extraordinarily good at reading outcomes. They didn't have the theoretical framework to explain why fermented beverages were safer than raw water, but they had generations of observation. They had the accumulated evidence of who got sick and who didn't. They had what we might call, in a modern context, empirical data, gathered not in a laboratory, but in the brutal, uncontrolled experiment of daily life, and they acted on it consistently, intelligently, effectively. That is not ignorance dressed up as wisdom. That is genuine wisdom operating without the vocabulary we would use to describe it. Let me tell you a little more about the practical reality of medieval ale production, because it's genuinely interesting and it reveals something about the social fabric of medieval life that tends to get overlooked. Ale brewing in medieval England was overwhelmingly a domestic activity, and it was overwhelmingly the work of women. The alewife, a woman who brewed ale either for household consumption or for small-scale commercial sale, was one of the most common female economic roles in medieval English society. The Assize of Ale, a regulatory framework established in the 13th century, set standards for the price and quality of commercially sold ale, and the records of fines and regulations associated with the assize provide an extraordinarily detailed picture of just how widespread and how important domestic ale production was. Virtually every household of any size brewed its own ale. The process was labor-intensive but straightforward. Grain, typically barley, though oats and wheat were also used depending on region and availability, was soaked in water and allowed to germinate, a process that converted the grain's starches into sugars. This malted grain was then dried, sometimes over a fire, which added a smoky character to the finished ale, and then mixed with hot water and allowed to steep, producing a sweet liquid called wort. The wort was then left to ferment. In the earliest medieval period, hops were not widely used in English ale production. That innovation came later, primarily from the continent, and was initially met with some resistance in England, where traditional unhopped ale had a sweeter, less bitter character than hopped beer. Instead, a mixture of herbs and spices called gruit was sometimes used to flavor the ale and provide some mild preservative function. The fermentation itself was managed by the naturally occurring yeast in the environment, present on the grain, in the air, on the surfaces of the brewing vessels. This wild fermentation was unpredictable by modern standards. Some batches were excellent, some were indifferent, some, presumably, were quite bad. But the basic transformation, sugars converted to alcohol and carbon dioxide by the action of yeast, happened reliably enough, often enough, to provide a constant supply of the low-alcohol beverage that kept medieval England hydrated and, crucially, alive. Now, let's talk about something even more interesting than ale. Let's talk about sour vegetables. Because while fermented beverages get most of the historical attention, the fermentation of vegetables, particularly in Eastern and Northern Europe, was arguably just as important to survival, and in some ways more fascinating from a nutritional standpoint. The most famous example is sauerkraut, but the tradition of fermenting vegetables in salt brine, essentially lactofermentation, where naturally occurring bacteria on the surface of vegetables convert sugars into lactic acid, was practiced across medieval Europe in countless regional variations. Turnips, cabbages, roots of various kinds, even certain fruits. Packed tightly into crocks or barrels with salt and sometimes water, sealed and left to ferment for days or weeks. The result was a preserved food that could last through an entire winter. But here is the part that makes this more than just a survival story. The fermentation process actually increased the nutritional value of those vegetables in some significant ways. The lactic acid bacteria responsible for the fermentation are producers of certain B vitamins. They break down some of the plant cell structures in ways that make nutrients more bioavailable, easier for the human digestive system to absorb. And crucially, this matters enormously in the context of medieval winter nutrition, fermented cabbage retains significant levels of vitamin C, even through months of storage. Fresh cabbage, by contrast, loses much of its vitamin C over time, particularly if stored in a root cellar for months. Sauerkraut held on to it. This is why northern European populations, who, by rights, should have suffered severe vitamin C deficiency through the long winter months when fresh vegetables were unavailable, largely did not. The fermented cabbage in the barrel in the cellar was keeping them healthy in a way that no one could have designed consciously because no one knew what a vitamin was. The protection was real, the mechanism was invisible, and the people eating the sauerkraut survived the winter with their health intact and had no idea why. I have to tell you about one particular aspect of medieval fermentation that I find almost poetically strange: the sourdough starter. If you have ever kept a sourdough starter, that jar of living, bubbling flour and water paste that you feed every day and that you treat, if you are being honest with yourself, with more care than some houseplants, then you have a personal connection to medieval food preservation that is more direct than almost anything else in this story. A sourdough starter is a community of wild yeast and bacteria captured from the surrounding environment, living in symbiosis in the flour-water mixture. It leavens bread, makes it rise, but it also, critically, acidifies the dough. The lactic and acetic acids produced by the bacteria in the starter lower the pH of the bread, which slows the growth of mold and extends the shelf life of the finished loaf significantly compared to bread leavened with commercial yeast. In a medieval household where bread was baked once or twice a week rather than daily, that extended shelf life mattered enormously. The fermentation process actually increased the nutritional value of those vegetables in some significant ways. The lactic acid bacteria responsible for the fermentation are producers of certain B vitamins. They break down some of the plant cell structures in ways that make nutrients more bioavailable, easier for the human digestive system to absorb. And crucially, this matters enormously in the context of medieval winter nutrition. Fermented cabbage retains significant levels of vitamin C, even through months of storage. Fresh cabbage, by contrast, loses much of its vitamin C over time, particularly if stored in a root cellar for months. Sauerkraut held on to it. This is why northern European populations, who, by rights, should have suffered severe vitamin C deficiency through the long winter months when fresh vegetables were unavailable, largely did not. The fermented cabbage in the barrel in the cellar was keeping them healthy in a way that no one could have designed consciously because no one knew what a vitamin was. The protection was real, the mechanism was invisible, and the people eating the sauerkraut survived the winter with their health intact and had no idea why. I have to tell you about one particular aspect of medieval fermentation that I find almost poetically strange: the sourdough starter. If you have ever kept a sourdough starter, that jar of living, bubbling flour and water paste that you feed every day and that you treat, if you are being honest with yourself, with more care than some houseplants, then you have a personal connection to medieval food preservation that is more direct than almost anything else in this story. A sourdough starter is a community of wild yeast and bacteria captured from the surrounding environment, living in symbiosis in the flour-water mixture. It leavens bread, makes it rise, but it also, critically, acidifies the dough. The lactic and acetic acids produced by the bacteria in the starter lower the pH of the bread, which slows the growth of mold and extends the shelf life of the finished loaf significantly compared to bread leavened with commercial yeast. In a medieval household where bread was baked once or twice a week rather than daily, that extended shelf life mattered enormously.
The connection between monastic tradition and European cheese heritage is not coincidental. It is the direct result of communities that had both the knowledge, the facilities, and the long-term institutional continuity to develop and refine fermentation techniques across multiple generations. We will come back to the monasteries in a later section because their contribution to medieval food science deserves its own dedicated time. But let me bring this all back to something personal, because I think that is what makes these stories stick. Fermentation is the only preservation method in this entire story that is fundamentally alive. Salt is a mineral, smoke is a chemical process, cold is physics, but fermentation is biology. It is the harnessing of living organisms, creatures so small that medieval people had no idea they existed, to do work on behalf of human survival. There is something about that relationship between human beings and the invisible microbial world that strikes me as one of the most profound and underappreciated partnerships in all of history.
We didn't domesticate only animals and plants, we domesticated microorganisms, yeasts, bacteria, the entire invisible ecosystem that lives in a crock of fermenting cabbage or a jar of sourdough starter or a wheel of aging cheese. We coaxed them. We created conditions they thrived in. We learned to read their moods, when the starter was too acidic, when the brine had gone wrong, when the fermentation had proceeded just far enough and needed to be stopped. We became, without knowing it, managers of microbial communities, partners with the invisible. And they, in return, kept us alive. Now, while fermentation was keeping people alive through one set of mechanisms, lactic acid, alcohol, acidity, there was another group of medieval practitioners who were approaching the preservation problem from a completely different direction. Not transformation through microbiology, transformation through something much more luxurious, much more golden, much more viscous and sweet and ancient. We're talking about honey, fat, and the art of sealing food away from the world entirely, of creating conditions so inhospitable to decay that food could survive not just a season, but years. Golden. That is the word that keeps coming back to me when I think about this section. Not the gold of wealth or royalty, though we will get there. The other kind of gold. The warm, slow, viscous gold of honey, moving in thick ribbons from a wooden spoon into a clay crock. The pale, almost translucent gold of rendered fat, cooling to a solid seal across the surface of a pot of cooked meat. The dull, dusty gold of beeswax, being pressed with warm hands around the rim of a sealed jar. 3 substances, 3 completely different materials, and yet all 3 were used in medieval Europe for exactly the same purpose: to build a wall between food and time. Not a wall of salt crystals, not a wall of smoke chemistry, not the cold wall of underground stone. Something altogether different. An airtight, breathless, absolute seal that cut food off from the outside world entirely, from oxygen, from moisture, from the airborne microorganisms that were always invisibly looking for a way in. And the extraordinary thing is that all 3 of these sealing methods were not just effective, they were, in their own particular ways, actively hostile to the forces of decay. Let me start with honey, because honey is the oldest, far older than the medieval period, far older, in fact, than recorded history. Archaeological evidence of honey being used to preserve food goes back to ancient Egypt. There are documented cases of honey-sealed vessels found in Egyptian tombs containing food that was, by any reasonable definition, still preserved after more than 3,000 years. 3,000 years. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. Your refrigerator keeps things good for about a week, maybe 2, before you start getting suspicious about the leftovers. Honey kept things for 3,000 years.
Now, obviously, the conditions in an Egyptian tomb are not standard kitchen conditions, but the underlying chemistry is real, and it works in medieval cellars just as effectively as it worked in ancient burial chambers. Honey is, from a microbiological standpoint, almost uniquely hostile to the organisms responsible for food spoilage. It has extremely low water activity, the same principle we encountered with salt and drying, but achieved through a completely different mechanism. Honey is so saturated with dissolved sugars that there is almost no free water available for bacteria or molds to use for their metabolic processes. They cannot grow in it. They cannot reproduce in it. They essentially suffocate in it, metabolically speaking. Additionally, honey contains small amounts of hydrogen peroxide, produced naturally by an enzyme that bees deposit during the production process. Hydrogen peroxide is an antimicrobial compound. Medieval people did not know about hydrogen peroxide. They did not know about water activity or osmotic pressure or any of the chemistry underlying what they were doing. They knew that fruit sealed in honey did not rot. They knew that certain meats stored under honey lasted through winter when nothing else would. And they knew that honey itself, pure, sealed honey, simply never seemed to go bad. Which, if you think about it, must have seemed almost miraculous. Everything rots, everything decays, everything succumbs to time, except honey. In medieval Europe, honey preservation was used primarily for fruits. The stone fruits of summer,
Cherries, plums, quinces, and certain varieties of pear were particularly prized candidates for honey sealing because they were sweet enough to complement honey's flavor, but perishable enough to be useless in winter without intervention. The technique varied by region and household, but the basic approach was consistent. The fruit was cleaned, sometimes lightly cooked to drive off surface moisture, and then packed into a clay or ceramic vessel and covered completely with honey. Every surface, every gap, every possible avenue of air contact sealed off by the thick golden liquid. The vessel was then stoppered and stored. Done well, the result could last not just through the winter, but into the following year. Medieval recipe collections from the 13th and 14th centuries contain repeated references to fruit preserved in honey as a luxury item, something served at the tables of the wealthy as a sweet course, or used to flavor cooked dishes when fresh fruit was unavailable.
The combination of honey's natural sweetness with the concentrated, slightly intensified flavor of the preserved fruit produced something genuinely more complex than the original fresh version. This is the detail that I keep finding remarkable. The preservation process did not just maintain the food, it improved it. The months spent sealed in honey changed the fruit in subtle ways, slightly firming the texture, allowing the natural fruit sugars to interact with honey sugars in ways that deepened and concentrated the flavor. You started with a cherry. You ended with something richer, more complex, more interesting. You ended with something that winter had made more itself rather than less. Now, here is something I did not know until I went looking for it, and it genuinely surprised me. Honey was not exclusively used for sweet foods. Meat was also preserved in honey in medieval Europe. Not commonly, honey was expensive enough that using it for meat preservation was a luxury that most households could not afford, but the historical record documents it. Certain meats, particularly small birds and game that were considered high-status foods, were packed in honey after cooking and sealed for storage. The effect was a product that was simultaneously preserved, flavored, and transformed. The honey drew some moisture from the meat while providing its antimicrobial barrier. And the long contact between the meat and the honey created a flavor profile that was, by all medieval accounts, considered a significant delicacy. This is not so different conceptually from what modern chefs do when they use honey glazes or honey-based cures. The technique has been modernized, refined, applied with 21st century understanding of the food chemistry involved. But the underlying insight that honey and meat together produced something extraordinary was worked out empirically in medieval kitchens by practitioners who understood it entirely through taste and outcome. Let me turn now to fat. Specifically to one of the most interesting and underappreciated preservation techniques in all of medieval cooking, confit. If you have eaten duck confit in a French restaurant, and if you have not, I would gently suggest you rectify that at your earliest convenience, then you have eaten a dish whose preservation logic is entirely medieval. The word confit comes from the French confire, meaning to preserve. And in its medieval form, confit was a preservation technique first and a cooking method second. Here is how it worked. A piece of meat, most commonly duck, goose, or pork, because these animals produce sufficient fat for the purpose, was first heavily salted and left to cure for a day or more. The salt drew out moisture and began the preservation process from within. The salted meat was then cooked very slowly, very gently for an extended period, submerged in its own rendered fat, not at a high temperature, not until browned or caramelized, at a low, trembling heat that was barely above the point of simmer for sometimes several hours, until the meat was thoroughly cooked through and every trace of remaining moisture had been driven from the tissue. The cooked meat was then lifted out and packed into a clay pot, and the hot fat, all of that rendered, clarified liquid fat, was poured over it until every surface of every piece was completely covered. As the fat cooled, it solidified. It contracted slightly as it hardened, pressing against the meat below and the walls of the pot around it, creating a seal that was, for practical purposes, completely airtight. No oxygen, no moisture, no access for airborne microorganisms. The meat sat inside its fat tomb, entirely cut off from the external environment.
And here is what makes confit genuinely remarkable from a food science perspective, separate from its preservation function. The fat does not just seal the meat, it also communicates with it. Over the weeks and months of storage, the fat slowly penetrates the surface layers of the meat, replacing the moisture that has been removed and changing the texture and flavor of the meat in ways that were impossible to achieve through any other cooking method. Properly made confit, aged for several weeks in its fat, has a richness and a depth of flavor that freshly cooked meat simply cannot match. The texture becomes silkier, the fat content of the meat increases slightly, making it more unctuous, more satisfying. The salt from the initial cure redistributes itself more evenly through the meat during storage, so that instead of a salty exterior and a blander interior, you get a consistent, well-seasoned depth of flavor throughout. Medieval cooks did not plan any of this. They were trying to preserve duck for winter, but what they discovered through the accidental alchemy of thyme and fat and salt was one of the most delicious preparations in all of European culinary tradition. The technique survived not because it was useful. It survived because once you had eaten confit that had been properly aged in its fat, you did not want the alternative. Now, you might reasonably ask, how long did confit actually last? The historical record on this is specific enough to be reassuring. Medieval household manuals and estate records suggest that properly made confit, sealed completely in fat, stored in a cool cellar, could keep for somewhere between 3 and 6 months without significant quality loss. Some accounts suggest even longer under ideal conditions.
This is, again, not so far from what modern refrigeration achieves with similar products. The physics of oxygen exclusion works regardless of the century. And the cellar temperatures we discussed earlier, that steady 50-degree Fahrenheit environment maintained by the thermal mass of the Earth, provided exactly the cold storage conditions that slowed any residual enzymatic activity within the fat itself. Fat can go rancid over time, even without microbial activity. It oxidizes in contact with air, developing off flavors that eventually make it unpleasant. But inside a sealed crock, in a cool cellar, with no air contact and no light, the oxidation was dramatically slowed. The confit held. Can I ask you something? Think about the last thing you sealed tightly in your kitchen. A leftover container snapped closed, a zip bag pressed shut, a jar lid twisted down firmly. You did not think about why you were sealing it. You just sealed it, automatically, because you know that sealed things keep better. That knowledge, that sealing food away from air extends its life, is so deeply embedded in how we think about food storage that we no longer register it as knowledge at all. It just seems obvious. But it was not obvious. It had to be discovered, had to be observed, tested, refined, practiced, and transmitted across generations until it became second nature. And the medieval practitioners of honey preservation and confit and wax sealing were, in their kitchens and their cellars, doing the hard work of making that discovery obvious for us. Wax sealing deserves its moment here too, because it operated on the same oxygen exclusion principle, but was used differently, primarily for hard cheeses and for the outer seals of ceramic storage vessels. Beeswax, heated to a liquid state, was painted or poured over the exterior of a cheese rind or pressed into the gaps around a crock stopper, and then allowed to cool and harden into an impermeable coat. Properly wax-sealed cheese could age in a cool cellar for many months, in some cases for over a year, with the rind protected from excessive moisture loss and the interior protected from the surface molds that might otherwise penetrate too deeply. This is not so different from what modern artisan cheesemakers still do. The wax coating on a wheel of Gouda or Edam, that familiar red or yellow or black exterior, is the direct descendant of medieval beeswax preservation practice. The material has evolved slightly. The principle has not changed at all. I find something quietly moving about the three substances we've explored in this section: honey, fat, and wax. All of them produced by living things. The honey by bees, from the nectar of flowers. The fat by the animal whose meat it preserved. The duck's own fat sealing the duck's own flesh. The wax, again, by bees, the same creatures responsible for the honey.
There's something almost circular about it. Life producing the substances that preserve life.
the natural world providing, from its own biology, the tools to push back against the decay that is also part of natural biology. Medieval people experienced this circularity without analyzing it. They kept bees not just for honey to eat, but for wax to seal with, and those were understood as connected functions of the same creature. The orchard and the beehive and the dairy and the larder were not separate systems. They were parts of a single integrated relationship between the household and the natural world it depended on. Everything connected to everything else. Every resource serving multiple purposes. Nothing wasted. There is one last thing I want to say about honey and fat and wax preservation before we move on. These techniques were not exclusively the domain of the wealthy. Salt was expensive. Certain spices were eye-wateringly costly. Even good preserving quality wood for smoking was not universally accessible. But honey, in a world where almost every rural household kept bees or had access to someone who did, was more democratically available than its reputation as a luxury ingredient suggests. Rendered fat was, if anything, more accessible to ordinary households than to wealthy ones, because ordinary people killed and processed their own animals and rendered every ounce of fat themselves, wasting nothing. And beeswax, similarly, was a byproduct of honey production, available wherever bees were kept. These were not aristocratic techniques, they were household techniques, practiced at every level of medieval society, scaled up or down according to what was available and what needed preserving. The wealthy households sealed their finest game and their most prized fruits in the purest filtered honey and the most carefully made confit. The peasant households sealed their small autumn slaughter of duck or goose in whatever fat the bird had yielded, and stoppered their vegetable crocks with whatever wax they could manage. Different scales, different qualities of ingredient, same fundamental understanding, same fundamental act of reaching forward through time, sealing something valuable away from decay, trusting that it would still be there when winter deepened and the cellar was the only kitchen left.
Hey, welcome back. If you have been with me through all of this, through the salt and the smoke, the cold, dark cellars, the bubbling fermentation crocks, the honey and the fat and the wax, and then into the long stone corridors of the monasteries, then first of all, thank you. I hope you are comfortable. I hope the lights are low and the blanket is pulled up and whatever is weighing on you today has set itself down somewhere outside the room for a little while. Because this is the last chapter of our time together tonight, and I want to take it slowly. I want to give it the space it deserves. We ended last time at the monastery gate, literally, standing at the point where the institutional world of the cloister met the wider world of the medieval countryside. And I said that the food knowledge and the food security that monasteries built were not kept entirely within their walls. That is where we begin now. Because here's the thing about walls. Medieval monastery walls were real. They were thick, often several feet of dressed stone, tall enough to create a genuine separation between the interior world of the cloister and the exterior world of the fields and villages and roads beyond. That separation was intentional, deliberate, part of the whole theological architecture of monastic life. The idea that the community within the walls occupied a different kind of space, a space set apart for prayer and work and the slow, patient cultivation of the soul. And yet, those walls had gates, and those gates opened every single day. They opened for the lay brothers who worked the outlying fields and returned at evening. They opened for the tradespeople who delivered grain and salt in barrels and rope. They opened for the pilgrims who were entitled by the rule of Saint Benedict to hospitality, to food and lodging, no questions asked, because a stranger at the gate was, in medieval theology, potentially an angel, and you did not turn angels away. They opened for the sick, because monastic infirmaries were in many regions the closest thing to a hospital that existed anywhere within traveling distance. They opened for the poor on certain days of the week, when surplus food from the monastic kitchen was distributed at the gate. And they opened for the tenant farmers and the local peasant communities, who existed in complex, layered, economically entangled relationships with the monastery that owned or managed the lands around them. All of that traffic, all of that daily human movement in and out through those thick stone gates carried things in both directions. It carried grain going in and bread coming out. It carried raw wool going in and repaired garments coming out. It carried sick people going in and occasionally, though not always, somewhat recovered people coming out. And it carried knowledge. Quietly, informally, without anyone sitting down to write a curriculum or design a training program, just in the ordinary, completely unremarkable way that knowledge has always traveled between human beings who were in regular contact with each other. A lay brother who spent 20 years working in the monastic dairy, watching the dairyman manage the aging process, helping turn the cheese wheels on the prescribed schedule, learning by hand and eye and nose what properly aging cheese looked and felt and smelled like, and then eventually left the monastery. Perhaps his order changed, perhaps family circumstances drew him back to the outside world, perhaps he simply wanted a different life. He took that knowledge with him. A tenant farmer's wife who received from the monastery's charitable distribution not just bread, but occasionally instruction, whose children were taught to read in the monastic school, who was present even peripherally in the orbit of an institution that was systematically, carefully over generations accumulating and refining knowledge about food.
She absorbed some of it, not formally, not through any designed transfer, just by proximity. And this is how knowledge actually travels most of the time, not in books, not in formal instruction, in proximity, in observation, in the quiet accumulation of watching someone who knows what they are doing and slowly, almost accidentally, learning to do it yourself. I want to be careful here not to over-romanticize this. The relationship between medieval monasteries and the communities around them was not uniformly benevolent. Monasteries were landowners, large ones, powerful ones. The relationship between a great Cistercian abbey and its dependent tenant farmers was an economic relationship, a legal relationship, sometimes an adversarial one. Monks were human beings, operating within a deeply unequal social structure, and they were not exempt from the self-interest and the occasional exploitation that characterized that structure. But the knowledge transfer was real nonetheless. And I think it matters. Because when you look at the regional food traditions of medieval Europe, the specific preservation techniques, the particular cheese varieties, the characteristic approaches to smoking or fermenting or drying that defined different localities, many of them map almost directly onto areas of dense monastic settlement. The great cheese traditions of Burgundy track the Cistercian expansion through that region in the 12th and 13th centuries. The sophisticated brewing traditions of the Low Countries correspond with the density of Benedictine and Augustinian monasteries across what is now Belgium and the Netherlands. The particular approach to salt fish processing in certain parts of the English north traces its systematic refinement to the Cistercian houses of Yorkshire, whose records show deliberate, organized engagement with fish preservation as part of their broader program of food self-sufficiency. These are not coincidences. They are the fingerprints of institutional knowledge slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely diffusing outward from the places where it was most carefully cultivated into the wider world that surrounded those places. And now I want to tell you about something specific, something that I think illustrates this entire dynamic better than any abstract argument I could make. There is a village in the French region of Burgundy. I am not going to tell you the exact name because the specifics matter less than the pattern, and the pattern repeats itself across dozens of similar sites across France and England and Germany. This village sits within a few miles of the ruins of a Cistercian abbey that was dissolved in the 16th century. The abbey itself is now a partial ruin, the walls still standing to a considerable height in some places, reduced to foundations in others. The great cellar undercrofts still intact beneath what remains of the main building, their vaulted stone ceilings unchanged from the day they were built sometime in the 12th century. In that village, there has been a family making cheese continuously, without significant interruption, for as long as any local record can trace. The cheese they make is not identical to whatever the monks made. It has evolved. The milk source has changed. The specific cultures have drifted over centuries. The techniques have been modified by each generation of cheesemakers in small ways that accumulated over time into something with its own distinct character. But the underlying method,
the approach to curdling and pressing and salting and aging, and the particular attention to the temperature of the aging cellar, which is still a stone-lined underground space maintained at a steady cool temperature by the thermal mass of the surrounding earth, that approach traces in a direct and unbroken line back to the Cistercian dairy that operated less than a mile from that family's farm for 4 centuries before the dissolution. The abbey is a ruin. The monks are gone. The institutional framework that supported the original development of that cheese is entirely dissolved. But the cheese is still there. The knowledge survived the institution that created it. It crossed the wall. It traveled through those open gates in the hands and memories and habits of people who were present when it was being cultivated, and it found new homes, new practitioners, new generations willing to carry it forward. That, to me, is the most quietly extraordinary thing in this entire story. Not the salt, not the smoke, not the cold cellars or the fermentation crocks or the ingenious physics of stockfish drying in Arctic wind. The most extraordinary thing is that the knowledge lasted.
In a world with no internet, no printing press for most of this period, no formal agricultural education, no food science journals, no regulatory bodies preserving traditional production methods, no heritage designation programs protecting regional food traditions, in that world, the knowledge lasted. It lasted because people cared enough to pay attention and to teach what they had learned and to keep doing what worked, generation after generation, in cold kitchens and dark cellars and windy smokehouses and quiet stone dairy rooms. And because they did, we are still eating the results. Let me come at this from a different angle for a moment, because I think there is one more dimension to the monastic contribution that deserves its own space before we start to bring this whole story toward its close. We have talked about what monasteries produced, what they preserved, how they managed their food stores, how their knowledge diffused outward into the wider community, but there is something else, something that operated at a larger scale and that had consequences extending far beyond the local. Monasteries were, in many cases, the primary institutional memory of the ancient world's food knowledge. Here's what I mean. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed across the 5th and 6th centuries, a vast amount of practical knowledge went with it. Roman agricultural texts, the systematic, empirical, practically detailed works of writers like Columella and Palladius, who had written with genuine rigor about farming methods, preservation techniques, animal husbandry, and food production, many of these texts survived only because monasteries preserved them. The monks who copied manuscripts in their scriptoria, who maintained libraries at a time when books were extraordinarily rare and precious objects, were not exclusively copying theological works. They were copying everything. Columella's De Re Rustica, a 1st century Roman agricultural encyclopedia of considerable depth and practical value, survived the early medieval period almost entirely through monastic manuscript preservation. Pliny the Elder's Encyclopedic Natural History, which contains significant sections on food production and preservation, survived the same way. And those texts were not just passively stored, they were read, used, cross-referenced against practical experience. The monk in the scriptorium who copied out Columella's instructions for salting olives was quite possibly also the monk who managed the olive press when the community's harvest came in. The text and the practice were not separate worlds. They informed each other. This is subtle but important because it means that monastic food knowledge was not purely empirical. It was a blend of accumulated practical experience and preserved theoretical tradition, each shaping and correcting each other across centuries. That combination, that layered, cross-referenced, institutionally supported knowledge system was producing results that no purely empirical tradition operating without texts could have matched. It is genuinely one of the most sophisticated intellectual operations in the medieval world. And it happened, almost entirely without anyone intending it to happen, in the cellars and kitchens and scriptoria of institutions whose primary stated purpose was something entirely different. That is the kind of thing that makes history wonderful to me. The gap between what institutions say they are doing and what they are actually contributing to the world. The distance between intention and consequence. Monasteries intended to save souls. They also, accidentally, systematically, over centuries, saved an extraordinary amount of human knowledge about how to keep food alive. And now we need to talk about something we have been circling around throughout this entire series. Something that shaped the whole food preservation world of medieval Europe in ways that touched every one of the methods we have discussed. Something that connects the cold cellar to the spice merchant's stall, the fermented cabbage crock to the court of the Byzantine emperor, the salted pork barrel in the English farmhouse to the pepper plantations of southern India. We have been talking all this time about how medieval people preserved food. But we have not yet talked about why, beyond simple survival, preserving food mattered at the civilizational scale. We have not talked about what food preservation made possible. And we have not talked about the substances that were woven through the entire preservation tradition, present in the cookbooks and the estate records and the monastic inventories, expensive, exotic, coming from the other side of the world, and more consequential for the history of this planet than almost any weapon ever forged. The spices.
I want to be careful about something here, because the popular history of medieval spices has a problem. It tends to be told in one of two ways. Either spices were used to cover up the taste of rotten meat, which is a myth we should put to rest right now, or spices were simply luxury goods, status symbols, ostentatious displays of wealth with no practical function beyond showing off. And while there is something to the second explanation, neither of those framings captures what spices actually were in the medieval preservation system. Let me start with the myth. The idea that medieval people used spices to disguise the taste of spoiled meat is one of those persistent historical fictions that sounds plausible but falls apart completely under even modest scrutiny. If your meat has spoiled badly enough to require pepper and cinnamon to make it edible, what you have is meat that is going to make you significantly ill regardless of how many spices you put on it. Medieval people knew this. They were not idiots. They ate spoiled food only when the alternative was starvation, and when they did, no amount of spicing made it safe. The spice to hide rotten meat story is, to be very direct about it, an invention. A bit of easy cynicism applied retrospectively to a world we have not bothered to understand properly. We can let it go. The reality is both more complex and more interesting. Spices did play a role in food preservation, but that role was not primarily about disguising spoilage, it was about prevention. Many of the spices most commonly used in medieval European cooking and preservation have genuine, demonstrable antimicrobial properties. Not in the romantic, vague sense of being generally good for you, in the specific, measurable sense that certain compounds present in these spices inhibit the growth of particular bacteria and molds. Cloves contain eugenol, a compound with demonstrated antimicrobial activity. Cinnamon contains cinnamaldehyde, which has been shown in laboratory conditions to inhibit a range of food spoilage and pathogenic bacteria. Pepper contains piperine, which has some antimicrobial effect. Ginger, nutmeg, cardamom, cumin, all of them contain active compounds that in various ways interfere with microbial activity.
Now, to be absolutely clear, medieval spice use was not designed around these properties. Nobody in a 14th century kitchen understood what cinnamaldehyde was or why it worked. The addition of spices to preserved meats and cured foods was not a deliberate antimicrobial strategy. But it was not random either. Over generations of observation, the same kind of careful empirical attention that drove every other aspect of medieval food preservation, people noticed that certain spiced preparations lasted longer, smelled better after storage, were safer to eat after weeks in a barrel. The conclusion was not a scientific one, it was a practical one. Spices help. Use them. And use them they did. The quantities of spice documented in medieval estate records and household accounts are genuinely staggering by modern standards. A wealthy English household in the late 14th century might spend as much on spices in a single year as on the wages of several household servants. Pepper, which we now take so completely for granted that we leave it on restaurant tables without a second thought, was expensive enough in medieval Europe that individual peppercorns were used as units of payment. Rents were paid in pepper, debts settled in pepper. The phrase peppercorn rent, which now means a nominally trivial amount, originally referred to a payment that was small in volume but significant in value. And pepper, expensive as it was actually one of the more affordable spices. Nutmeg, mace, cloves, and especially saffron occupied a price register that most ordinary households could never reach at all. These were the spices of the wealthy. They appeared in the great feast menus of royal courts and noble houses, preserved in honey with expensive fruits, worked into elaborately spiced sauces for roasted meats, added in small but carefully measured quantities to the preserved provisions that stocked a lord's traveling pantry. But here is the dimension of this story that I really want you to sit with tonight. The spice trade was not just an economic phenomenon, it was a geopolitical one. The desire for spices in medieval Europe, the hunger for pepper and cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg, the willingness of wealthy households and royal courts to pay extraordinary prices for these substances, that desire, that hunger, that willingness, they shaped the map of the world.
Because spices came from very specific places. Most of the spices that medieval Europeans valued most highly originated in South and Southeast Asia. Pepper from the Malabar coast of what is now India, cinnamon from what is now Sri Lanka, nutmeg and cloves from the Banda Islands in the Moluccas in what is now eastern Indonesia. Places that were not just far away from medieval Europe, they were, for most of this period, effectively unreachable by direct routes. The spice trade that supplied medieval European markets was not a direct trade, it was a chain. A long, elaborate, multiply intermediated chain of merchants and traders and middlemen stretching from the production regions of South and Southeast Asia, through the ports of India and the Persian Gulf, through the trading cities of the Arab world, through the Byzantine Empire, through the great entrepot ports of the Eastern Mediterranean, Venice, Genoa, Amalfi, and then finally, after passing through the hands of perhaps a dozen different merchants, each taking their cut, arriving in the markets of Northern and Western Europe at prices that reflected every link in that chain. The Arab traders who dominated the middle section of this route were not just passive conduits, they were active managers of the trade, and they were not inclined toward transparency about where their goods actually came from. Medieval European merchants who bought spices in Alexandria or Constantinople generally knew that the goods came from somewhere to the east. They did not know precisely where. And this opacity, this carefully maintained mystery about the actual geographic origins of the most valuable commodities in the world was one of the most consequential pieces of deliberate commercial strategy in all of history. Because it meant that as long as the Arab and Byzantine traders controlled the middle of the spice route, the European end of the market was permanently dependent on them, permanently paying the middleman's price, permanently unable to go around the chain and deal directly with the source. That dependency gnawed at European merchants and at European rulers for generations, and eventually, driven by exactly that frustration, by the desire to find a direct route to the source of the spices, to cut out the middlemen and access the pepper plantations and the clove islands directly, European sailors began pushing out into the ocean, not to discover new worlds, at least not initially, to find spices.
The Portuguese exploration of the African coast through the 15th century, which culminated in Vasco da Gama's rounding of the Cape of Good Hope and arrival on the Malabar coast of India in 1498. Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic in 1492, which he believed, and was wrong about, was a western route to the Spice Islands of Asia. The entire European age of exploration, the set of events that produced the modern world, the encounter of the Old World with the New World, the establishment of global trade routes, the beginning of European colonialism and all of its catastrophic consequences. All of that traces back, in part, to the desire for spices, and the desire for spices traces back, in part, to the need to preserve food. I sit with that chain of causation sometimes, and I find it almost impossible to fully absorb. The peasant woman packing pork in salt to get through the winter. The Lord's cook adding cloves to a sauce of preserved meat to improve its keeping qualities. The merchant paying outrageous prices for those cloves in an Alexandrian market. The European king funding an ocean voyage to find the source of those cloves. The sailor stepping onto the shore of a continent nobody in Europe knew existed. All of it connected, all of it part of the same long chain. The chain that starts with hunger, with the very simple and very urgent human need to have enough to eat,
and ends, though it never really ends, somewhere so far from where it started that the connection is almost invisible. Almost, but not quite. Now, I want to slow all the way down, because we have been moving through 1,000 years of history tonight, and I think we need to stop for a moment before we get to the end and just breathe. Just look around at where we are. We started in a cold kitchen, a woman's hands pressing pork into salt crystals, not knowing why it worked, just knowing that it did. And from that image, we have traveled through the salt flats of the Atlantic coast and the smokehouses of medieval farmyards. We have gone underground into the cool earth of cellar and pit. We have watched fermentation transform milk into cheese and grain into ale, and cabbage into something that kept people healthy through winters when nothing fresh grew. We have seen honey seal summer's sweetness against winter's demand. We have seen fat create perfect airtight tombs for the autumn's meat, preserving it in a form that became somehow better than the original. We have walked through monastery gates and into cellars where generations of patient, methodical, institutionally supported knowledge was accumulated and refined and eventually allowed to cross back out into the wider world. And we have followed the thread of spice all the way from a medieval kitchen in England to a harbor in Lisbon to a ship on the open Atlantic and eventually to the other side of the world. All of that from one woman and one barrel and one act of pressing pork into salt. I promised you at the beginning that by the time we were done, you would look at your refrigerator differently. Maybe even feel a little guilty about it. Just a little. And I want to make good on that promise, but not in the way you might expect. Because I don't actually want you to feel guilty. Guilt is not the point here. The point is something more interesting and more useful than guilt.
When you open your refrigerator, what you are looking at is the end of a very long conversation. A conversation between human beings and the forces of decay and time that goes back further than any written record, further than any archaeological evidence, back to the first moment some early human noticed that food left in a certain place, a cold cave, a dry wind, a pool of concentrated salt water, lasted longer than food left elsewhere, and that this observation was worth remembering and acting on. Every method in your refrigerator and around it is connected to that conversation. The vacuum-sealed leftovers in the plastic container, oxygen exclusion, the same principle as confit and wax sealing and honey preservation, the principle that medieval cooks were applying to duck legs and stone fruits and clay crocks 1,000 years before anyone invented plastic. The smoked salmon on the bagel you had for breakfast this week, if you had one, wood smoke, phenols and aldehydes, and the same complex antimicrobial chemistry that medieval smokehouses were deploying in October to get the autumn fish through to spring. The specific wood still matters, by the way. Cold smoked salmon producers are extraordinarily particular about which wood they use and why. A medieval smokehouse operator would have understood that conversation immediately. The yogurt, the sauerkraut, the sourdough bread, the beer, the cheese, all of them fermentation, all of them the controlled, carefully managed partnership between human beings and the invisible microbial world that medieval people cultivated entirely without knowing what they were cultivating. The dried mushrooms and herbs in the back of the pantry, sun or wind removing water from food so thoroughly that decay cannot get a grip. The same principle that turned Norwegian cod into a commodity that crossed the Alps. The same principle that turned Andalusian figs into a product that traveled medieval trade routes for hundreds of miles. Even the salt in the shaker on the table. The salt that you knock over and perhaps toss over your shoulder for luck. That salt has a history stretching back through medieval tax rebellions and Hanseatic trade routes and Atlantic salt pans and peasant families calculating exactly how many ounces they needed to get the autumn pig through to February.
You are surrounded by the residue of 1,000 years of solving the same problem we began with tonight. How do you keep food from killing you? How do you make what you have now last long enough to matter when you need it later? How do you push back against the natural world's constant, patient, relentless effort to reclaim everything you have built? Medieval people answered those questions with attention and patience and ingenuity and the particular kind of intelligence that comes from very high stakes and no safety net. And we, standing in our modern kitchens with our electric appliances and our vacuum seal bags and our freezer drawers, are still using their answers. We have refined them, mechanized them, industrialized them beyond all recognition. But the underlying logic, the fundamental insight that salt and smoke and cold and fermentation and drying and sealing and careful systematic knowledge all have power over time, that insight is theirs. We just forgot to give them credit. So here is what I want to leave you with tonight, as the lights get a little lower and the blanket gets a little heavier and the day's noise gets a little further away. The next time you do something in your kitchen that feels automatic, that feels like just what you do, that feels so obvious it barely registers as a choice at all, the next time you sprinkle salt, the next time you put leftovers in a sealed container, the next time you open a jar of pickles or slice into a smoked piece of meat or tear a piece of sourdough bread and notice that particular sour depth of flavor that commercial bread does not have, pause, just for a second. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just quietly, and acknowledge the chain. Acknowledge that the thing you just did without thinking is the far end of something that someone, somewhere, a very long time ago, did for the first time with a great deal of thought, with attention and care and the particular gravity that comes from knowing that if you got it wrong, you and the people who depended on you might not eat in February.
They got it right. They kept getting it right, generation after generation, refining and passing forward and refusing to let go of what worked. And because they did, here you are, with a refrigerator full of food. And now, ideally, with eyes that are getting a little heavy. That is everything for tonight. Every barrel of salt, and every plank of stockfish, and every sourdough starter, and every stone cellar, and every gate that swung open in the Cistercian monastery wall at dawn, all of it brought us here, to this moment where you are comfortable and warm and fed, and the world outside is doing whatever it is doing, and none of it is your concern right now. Let it all drift. The cold kitchen is quiet. The fire is banked low. The cellar is full. Sleep well, and I will see you next time.